Post-World War II, the aircraft carrier has shrugged off its competitors for the #1 position in the fleet. The years of nuclear brinkmanship almost saw the relegation in favour of fast submarines. But the Grey Ladies have shown their adaptability and potency time and again to become what they are today, the essence of sea power. In today's domination of the oceans, it is not argued that the nuclear aircraft carrier is the reigning monarch. Though for a time, the ascendancy of guided missiles and fast submarines raised debates as to whether the Grand Ladies would be replaced, just as they had supplanted the great battleships during the Second World War. However, the turn away from specific nuclear conflicts and the concept of limited conventional war has made the role of the modern aircraft carrier and their associated carrier attack group one of the most adaptable and decisive of military forces. While some of the roles they perform have varied, the force they convey gives the Navy control of the sea lanes, as well as a region as far inland as necessary to establish safe zones and areas of control. The aircraft carrier groups operating from international waters provide a presence, which can be increased or withdrawn as the situation dictates. Should the situation escalate, the carrier and air wing are ready on arrival to accomplish whatever mission is given, from unobtrusive surveillance to strikes and anything in between. Although aircraft carriers are routinely deployed near traditional areas of potential conflict, their ability to move to another area of the world should a crisis erupt and be ready to operate upon arrival has made them the big guns in the roles in which they are employed today. The development of these new supercarriers is a product of the 50 years of turmoil following their baptizing in the Second World War. These periods of global conflicts have seen the carriers grow significantly in scale and scope to meet the many and varied threats confronting them. In 1928, the US operated 3 carriers. These 3 ships allowed development of concepts and trials in the new theories of naval air warfare. The 3 ships were trialled as task groups in many and varied hypothetical situations. It soon became obvious that the larger carriers, Saratoga and Lexington, would be significantly more capable than originally thought. In a series of fleet problems, the carriers demonstrated their effectiveness when they proved their enthusiast theories conclusively. In 1932 and 38, war games were again conducted in regard to Pearl Harbor, and again a profound result in favour of the carriers. These games proved their worth in the coming years, with the commanders gaining valuable practice, and the crews and pilots honing the skills that they would be needing in the very near future. Technologies rapidly advanced. The greater lift from 2 wings of the original biplanes allowed short takeoff and the safest possible returns to the flight decks with slower landing speeds. However, the advances in aeronautics soon made the biplane's graces a liability. The US Navy's first intentionally designed carrier was Ranger, launched in 1939. She proved to have shortcomings, primarily due to lack of size and speed. The older Saratoga and Lexington had been built on battle cruiser hulls and were significantly larger. The Yorktown-class aircraft carriers were built not long before World War II. The first 2 ships, Yorktown and Enterprise, were commissioned in 1937 and 1938. The lessons learned from operations with the larger battlecruiser conversion Lexington class versus the smaller Ranger taught the Navy that large carriers, rather than small ones, were more operationally flexible and survivable. Thanks to these lessons, the Navy built the new carriers to the largest tonnage that the treaties of the time allowed, 25,000 tons. The resulting ships were large, flexible and powerful, giving the US Navy fire carriers totaling 134,000 tons, which, with the addition of the 20,000-ton Wasp, another small carrier, brought the US Navy up to the full treaty tonnage limit. The scrapping of the treaty system in 1937 allowed the US to begin building more carriers. The first of this new carrier program was another Yorktown class. Hornet, commissioned in 1941. Improvements of lessons learned in Yorktown design brought about the Essex class. During the same period, the fleet problem exercises again showed up the significant weaknesses in the defence of Pearl Harbor to air attack from carrier-based planes. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese combined fleet would settle all arguments regarding air power at sea by exploiting Pearl's weaknesses. Here, the 6 Imperial carriers would remove a very significant percentage of the American fleet, almost solely with the use of their air power. Immediately after the losses at Pearl, it fell to the remaining carriers to hold the line until the new Essexes would be able to make up the numbers. These existing carriers proved their worth in many battles, including the Coral Sea, Midway, and Leyte Gulf. The first of the Essex class would not be commissioned until December of 1942. The USS Essex itself was over 60 feet longer, nearly 10 feet wider, and more than a third heavier than the Yorktown. As a mark of their worth, none of the Essex-class carriers were lost, and 2 of them, Franklin and Bunker Hill, came home under their own power even after being grievously damaged. The Franklin itself, as sea battles drew closer to the Japanese homeland, suffered tremendous damage when 2 armor-piercing bombs pierced the flight deck and ignited fuel stores and ammunition. The ship was racked by huge explosions. Only the efforts of the crew eventually saved the ship, and she made it back to Pearl Harbor and then New York under her own power. The next class of carrier built was the Midway series, first commissioned in late 1945. The lead ship of the class, USS Midway, was not decommissioned until 1991, shortly after seeing service in the Gulf War. These were some of the longest-lived carrier designs in modern history. The class was originally conceived as the largest aircraft carrier of the era. At 45,000 tons, almost twice the size of the Essex class at 27,000 tons, their size grew from strengthened armour and bigger engines, but also to provide the ability to carry more planes than any other carrier in the US fleet, 30 to 40 more than the Essex class. In their original configuration of World War II aircraft, they had an air wing of almost 130 aircraft. It turned out, though, that these numbers were well beyond the control ability of a single ship. However, perhaps fortuitously, jet technologies were dawning, and the greater carrying ability of the class made it perfect for the larger and heavier jet fighter planes that started showing up in the late 1940s and 1950s. The jets of the era were replacing the pinnacle of the piston-engine Navy planes, Douglas Helldivers, F-4U Corsairs, or F-6F Hellcats. Grumman's F-7F Tigercat was one of the many new suitors to lose against the rapidly evolving jet field. Designed to fill all carrier roles, this twin-propeller fighter could also carry bombs or a torpedo. It was McDonnell's FH-1 Phantom that first took to the air in 1945 and from a carrier in 1946 as the US Navy's first true jet fighter. The advances being made in jet experiences saw many different designs ordered, though only in small numbers, as the models were rapidly outdated by the rapid leaps in technology. Over 20 different fighter types were trialled in the 10 years after the FH-1 was introduced. The larger, heavier and faster planes caused major changes as a matter of course in the decks and design of the carriers. The early 1950s saw three major changes: the angle deck, the return of catapults, and the change to electronic landing controls. The angled deck was a huge advance as the increased momentum of jets was causing significantly higher landing accidents. The existing crash barriers could not contain the heavier planes, and the resultant spilling jet fuel and armaments was a recipe for disaster. The angled deck let a pilot who missed catching and arrest a wire open throttle and gain altitude for a second attempt. The Midway class and 14 of the Essex class were progressively fitted with new angled decks, along with greater fire control and fuel storage for the thirsty new jets. Another advancement was the installation of steam catapults. These became essential as the planes became heavier and larger. Today, they can fire a throttling jet forward at 170 miles an hour in 300 feet. The batsman, as seen on earlier carriers, would leap about the deck, directly warning the incoming pilot of vagrancies in his approach. The speed of the jets forestalled any real ability of biplane between the batsman and pilot. By the time the batsman had his meaning across, the issue he was translating may have become a terminal problem. The meatball lights directly aided the pilot in lining up for the landing. If the lights line up with the appropriate marker light in the mirror, then the pilot knows he's on course. As the angle at which the pilot looks at the lights changes, he can see directly the adjustment he needs to make. Too high, too low, and if the pilot is very low, a wave off. There are variations built in to adapt to each style of plane and differing weather condition. In theory, the pilot flies the plane down a narrow, safe corridor straight onto the carrier deck. It is estimated that the angled deck and automated landings have halved the accidents on US carriers. 1952 saw construction beginning of a new class of ship. The Forrestal class was the first class of supercarriers of the Navy. So called because of their extraordinarily high tonnage, 75,000 tons, fully integrated angled deck, very large island, and extremely strong air wing. Compared to the Midway class, the Forrestals were 100 feet longer and nearly 30 feet beamier, resulting in a far more stable and comfortable aircraft platform, even in very rough weather. Forrestal class ships were the first examples of supercarriers, but also the first which were to have nuclear weapons as an option for their aircraft. With the Korean conflict looming, the class went into production. The replacement of centerline elevators with port and starboard side lifts freed up huge areas of deck space. With 4 instead of 2 catapults, the Forrestals could launch up to 8 planes a minute. These were the first truly jet-oriented carriers. Launched in 1954 and commissioned 10 months later, USS Forrestal was the first of 6 in the class over the next 10 years. By this time, the introduction of nuclear intercontinental missiles made the necessity of dropping nuclear bombs from planes outdated. While their ability and fast deployment of forces maintained a solid demand for the carriers, their costs were now beginning to gain notice of politicians. The 8th USS Enterprise was the world's first nuclear supercarrier. She remains the longest aircraft carrier in the world today, though in tonnage she is surpassed by the Nimitz-class. When launched, the Enterprise was the most powerful weapon ever constructed. She was also the most expensive, $451.3 million. The previous Forrestal was $188 million. Enterprise's propulsion is provided by 6 of her 8 reactors at any time, as 6 reactors generate the maximum steam the turbines can handle. Her keel was laid in 1958, and she was launched on 24 September 1960. Enterprise was intended to be the first of a class of 6 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. However, costs ballooned during her construction, and remaining vessels were never laid down. The following Kitty Hawk-class aircraft carriers were all conventionally powered ships. Series production of nuclear carriers would finally commence with the keel laying of USS Nimitz. The first of the Nimitz-class of supercarriers, the lead ships of the class, was commissioned in 1975 with a bill of $1,181 million. As of 2004, George H.W. Bush, the 10th of the last of the class, is being built by Northrop Grumman Newport News and will enter service in 2008. Bush will be the first transition ship to a new class of carriers to start construction in 2007. By tonnage, the Nimitz-class composed by far the largest class of carriers ever built. When Bush is completed, the 10 ships of the class will total just under 1 million tons combined displacement. USS Nimitz was the first to undergo its initial refueling during a 33-month refueling complex overhaul in 1998. Aircraft carriers have undergone innumerable changes. Amazingly though, these powerful ships have only existed for less than a century. Yet they have undergone a metamorphosis of unbelievable proportions. The USS Langley, the US's first carrier, was only 10,000 tons displacement. The Nimitz-class is nearly 100,000 tons. The changes have included such items as size, displacement and accommodation, to flight deck layout, habitability and propulsion. Oddly, most of these changes have actually occurred during the last 40 years. The US carrier fleet has components that are relatively new and some that are beginning to age. The USS Enterprise, commissioned in 1960, is now over 40 years old. While still a potent weapon, Enterprise will have to be retired within a few more years. Nimitz, the lead ship of the current class, is now nearly 25 years old. The next class of aircraft carrier is already on the drawing boards. The Navy was originally going to build a totally new class of ship, called the CVX. But with rising developmental costs, an evolved Nimitz-class is to carry on for the future. The new class will be slightly larger than the current ships, carry approximately the same number of aircraft, about 80, but require less manpower than the current ships. This will be accomplished through increased automation of many tasks. The Navy has long had the ability to automate many tasks, but has been reticent to do so due to the ability of people to reason in an emergency situation. Stealth will be increased by reducing the number of antennae and other protrusions and rounding off anything that can be. This should reduce the ship's radar signature considerably. Other measures will follow for cooling of topside structures to minimize the thermal signature as well. Concepts are for a ship of 100,000 plus tons, with a flight deck of approximately 1,040 feet in length. The crew would number somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000. The next generation of carrier, hull number CVN-78, is programmed to start construction in 2007 and is slated to be placed in commission in 2014 to replace USS Enterprise, which will be over its 50-year mark. CVN-79 is programmed to begin construction in 2012 and to be placed in commission in 2018. Whatever the design vagaries of the new carrier class, the place of the aircraft carrier seems certain for at least the foreseeable future. These grand ships with continual improvement have stood the test of time, and their current dominance in the world of sea power seems assured.
The development of aircraft for Navy carriers, from canvas and cloth to the throaty monsters of the Second World War, was a long and sometimes erratic affair. Along with developments in the aircraft carrier, these weapons proved capable of closing the period of history ruled by the battleship. Two planes in particular shone through the Pacific conflicts, and many of the lessons learnt in their baptism of fire are still valid today on even the most modern of aircraft carrier. Post-World War I, in a series of fleet problems, the early carriers demonstrated their effectiveness when they proved their enthusiast theories conclusively. In 1928, fleet carrier Langley totally surprised the installations at Pearl Harbor and theoretically achieved significant damage to the area. 1 year later, the larger carriers proved the same result, with conclusive results again around the Panama Canal. These results were repeated in the years up until World War II in the many trials conducted. Broadly, the results forced the battle groups to begin taking the carrier as a more significant threat to themselves and the outcome of the encounters. These exercises proved their worth in the coming years, with the commanders gaining valuable practice and the crews and pilots honing the skills they would need in the dark years to come. The development of these skills began at the turn of the century with the early concepts of manned flight. By 1909, we were barely able to claim mastery of building petrol-driven four-wheel vehicles, or cars as they became known. Yet some forward thinkers were already adapting the internal combustion engine to powering aircraft. In Virginia, during one of the Wright brothers' subsequent flights of their Kitty Hawk, a naval observer, Lieutenant George Sweet, remarked that the Navy must have that. It will be most important to us. With these words, Sweet basically instigated the joining of air power and naval power. The Navy's first attempts at air power concentrated on taking off and landing on water. In 1910 in Virginia, a civilian pilot named Eugene Healy tested the idea of taking off from a ship and landing on terra firma. He used a wooden ramp built over the bow of a cruiser as a runway for a 50 horsepower Curtiss. He was successful, and 2 months later he attempts the reverse, taking off on land and touching down on a ship. The next achievement towards aircraft and their use at sea occurred in 1921, when the US Navy ran bombing tests on captured ships. Brigadier General Billy Mitchell oversaw the operation. The newspapers were quick to announce that with such a weapon as the plane, the day the battleship was over. The Navy was quick to remind the media and people that the battleship used in the test was a sitting duck. It did not return fire or in any way take defensive action. Directly after the Great War, the world's major navies were to show great enthusiasm in the promise embodied in the airplane. The successful flight of the NC-4 flying boat in May 1919 achieved the first crossing of the Atlantic by air. Just prior to the transatlantic flight, the US Atlantic Fleet began training with their own aviation detachment. Biplanes were launched off a wooden deck erected on the battleship Texas. In a great leap forward during July 1919, the US Navy ordered the Collier Jupiter to be converted into the US Navy's first aircraft carrier. By 1922, the Collier's transformation was complete and had become America's first aircraft carrier. She was rechristened USS Langley. Arresting wires were strung across the deck of the runway, and planes were fitted with hooks which would catch the wires and bring the plane to a halt. The first of many problems became apparent. The undercarriages of the planes were simply not strong enough to cope with the rough landings. The strong and lightweight metals of today, such as titanium or materials such as carbon fibre, were not yet available. So strengthening came at a cost, and the cost was weight. However, some remedies were simple enough and made enough difference to prove that using planes from the Langley was feasible. These included designing planes that gave pilots better visibility over the nose of the plane to give them better judgment when landing, the track of the undercarriage to increase stability, and better training procedures. The British were also developing sea takeoffs, and this was one idea, the laying down of a buoyant runway, which was not overly successful. The British returned to the more conventional aircraft carrier, and the same problems as the Americans. Many Vought planes found their way into the Navy's service. Among the models were twin-seat observation planes and float planes, but it was the fighter version that was to establish the company's association with the US Navy. On October 17, 1922, it was a VE-7 that took off for the first time from the decks from the US Navy's original aircraft carrier, the Langley. This marked the long and at times daunting development phase of naval aviation. The requirements for naval aircraft are much more encompassing and demanding than those planes destined for land-based assignment. A pilot requires very good visibility and a tough plane to withstand carrier landings. Because the gap between a landing and a crashing is very narrow, pilots continued to force their planes onto the deck trying to attain a hookup. Early on in the development of carrier aircraft, the Navy filmed many equipment failures. These films stand as a record of the problems that were overcome by the Vought engineers in their achievements of the VE-7 and its subsequent models. Many models after the VE-7 were submitted to the military, although none were taken up in the fighter role. One of the reconnaissance series of these aircraft were called the Corsair. In 1922, the Washington Naval Reduction Treaty was signed to halt the battleship's arms race, which was threatening to bankrupt entire countries. When the United States signed the treaty, they agreed to halt construction of the 13 new battleships and battlecruisers being built. Two of these hulls went on to become the largest aircraft carriers in the world, the Lexington and Saratoga, and the rest were scrapped. In 1928, the US operated her 3 carriers. These 3 ships allowed the development of concepts and trials in the new theories of naval air warfare. The 3 ships were trialled as task groups and task forces in many and varied hypothetical situations. It soon became obvious that the larger carriers, Saratoga CV3 and Lexington CV2, would be significantly more capable than originally thought. In a series of fleet problems, the carriers demonstrated their effectiveness when they proved their enthusiast theories conclusively. In 1928, fleet carrier Langley totally surprised the installations at Pearl Harbor and theoretically achieved significant damage to the area. 1 year later, the large carriers proved the same result, with conclusive results again around the Panama Canal. In Fleet Problem 9 in January 1929, the Saratoga and 1 escort were intentionally separated from the main battle group and launched a surprise strike against the Panama Canal, theoretically disabling it and dividing the world in half. The success of the strike marked the birth of the Air Carrier Task Force. The subsequent refining of the concept became the carrier attack groups that would roam the Pacific during World War II. The Yorktown-class aircraft carriers were built not long before World War II. The first 2 ships, Yorktown CV5 and Enterprise CV6, were commissioned in 1937 and 1938. After the devastation of Pearl Harbor, the balance of the Pacific conflict fell to the US aircraft carriers. The following 6 months saw a holding action against the Imperial forces, with sporadic minor raids battle training the forces of the Allied nations. The inspiring Doolittle raid on Tokyo forced the Imperial Navy into choosing to fight in both the Central and Southern Pacific before the entire American economy and resources could be brought to bear. It was the planes from the aircraft carriers Saratoga and Lexington that would be the first to change the way sea battles would be fought in the future. The location of the initial battles was north of Australia in the Coral Sea. For the first time in history, a sea battle was fought entirely by aircraft. A Japanese force was rounding the north of New Guinea to capture Port Moresby. If they were successful, they would have a platform to invade Australia. The battle was fierce and losses on both sides were severe. The Yorktown's flight deck received 1 hit from an aircraft bomb but survived. The Lexington, however, took 3 hits and sank that night. A destroyer and an oiler were also lost. The Japanese lost a carrier with another damaged. Only a month after the Coral Sea, Japanese codes were broken and the information was devastating for the Americans. It was learned that Admiral Yamamoto was planning a massive attack on the strategically valuable Midway Islands in the Central Pacific. This battle was to become known historically as the Battle of Midway. The odds for the Americans seemed overwhelming. They had no battleships and the Japanese had 9. 8 American cruisers against a force of 15 Japanese cruisers. The American carriers, the Hornet, Yorktown and Enterprise, were to face 4 Japanese carriers. However, the US Navy had one advantage, and that was surprise. The Japanese were unaware of the American carriers, and when the planes started their attack, the Japanese were caught with flight decks packed with planes, fuel and high explosive bombs. In the commotion, they could not get their planes into the air quickly enough. When the battle is over, all the Japanese carriers and 1 cruiser is on the bottom. The Americans fared better, but still lost their carrier Yorktown with more than 100 aircraft. It was the second time that aircraft had been a major force in a sea battle, and now the pressure was on to develop planes specifically for carrier work. June 26, 1942, just after the Battle of Midway, a new plane rolls out from the Grumman Aircraft Factory. Some people interpreted the plane as the Grumman Wildcat's big brother, but this was not so. This was a totally new fighter. The plane was designed to even the score against the remarkable Japanese Mitsubishi Zero. The Zero had for some time been the gunfighter in the sky over the Pacific. The Hellcat was about to challenge this air superiority. The Hellcat was primarily designed to be used on carriers, although a few were flown from land bases. The Hellcats were deployed firstly to the larger carriers like the new Essex-class. The USS Essex CV-9 itself was over 60 feet long, nearly 10 feet wider and more than a third heavier than the Yorktowns. As a mark of their worth, none of the Essex-class carriers were lost, and two of them, Franklin CV-13 and Bunker Hill CV-17, came home under their own power even after being grievously damaged. On April 5, 1943, a Hellcat squadron downed the first Zero, and this was the way it would be for the remainder of the war. During June 1944, the Hellcat broke the back of the Japanese Zero. This was the battle which was described by one American pilot as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the day's end, the Japanese had lost 356 planes. The Allies had lost just 16. It was one of the highest American kill ratios in a single day. It was only the Hellcat's ability to take the fight to the Zero that allowed the Pacific theatre to be secured by the Allies. The Hellcat's battle ratio of 19:1 saw that of 6,477 Japanese planes downed over the Pacific, well over 5,000 are credited to Hellcats. During the same period, the Voight Company had developed their concept of a carrier fighter. The differences in the design philosophies between the extremely successful Hellcat and the new Corsair I saw the Hellcat make some performance sacrifices to achieve safer carrier landings at slower speeds, whereas the Corsair was designed to be a carrier plane, but performance was its prime objective. The new F-4U Corsair I became America's first 400-mile-an-hour fighter. Unfortunately, its performance caused questions over the Corsair's safety and led to it only being assigned to land-based operations initially. It was the units obtained by the British Fleet Air Arm that swayed the US Navy into re-evaluating and accepting the F-4U for their carriers. The English had a long history with aircraft carriers and their opinions were well respected. Quickly, the British pilots came to truly appreciate the performance of their Corsairs. With some modification to the landing gear to reduce the bounce and the adoption of a curving approach on landing to maintain the pilot's visibility, the F-4Us went into operation. One other modification was required, removing 4 inches off each wing for storage, so as to fit below decks on the small English escort carriers. The American Marines based at the newly acquired Henderson Field on Guadalcanal had to fight stiff Japanese opposition to maintain their hold in the area. With battle damage, the primitive conditions and an unfinished airstrip, Henderson Field was soon littered with damaged aircraft. On the 12th of February, the Marines received their first F-4Us, and on the first day, most pilots logged over 9 hours in action. From the British results and the enthusiastic reviews of the Marines in the Pacific, the US Navy began retesting the F-4U in April 1944, and they were eventually cleared for carrier service. This proved timely as the Japanese war machine was now employing the desperate kamikaze operations, and the Corsair's power was sorely needed. During the course of the Pacific campaigns, the Corsairs maintained a loss ratio of over 11 to 1, an impressive legacy even by today's standards. The end of the war coincided with the crossroads in engine technologies. The new jet engines were in, and propellers were old hat. As a mark of their abilities, the Marines and Navy kept their F4Us when most of the other models were simply scrapped. Comparing the planes of the day against the new Phantom, the Corsair was only 30 miles an hour slower, but had almost twice the range and could carry significantly more load. This would prove to be a wise choice, with the Korean Peninsula only a short period away. With their large load capacity and very accurate close in-ground support, the Corsairs tied up most of the Chinese transport and supply needs. The combination of American aircraft and their carriers gave the US and their allies virtual air supremacy. The Marines' efforts in Korea shine with the merits of the Corsair. The planes handled the extremely basic conditions on the matted strips with ease. The cold, though, was another matter. With the weather this extreme, the planes simply froze up. Even the Chinese could do little when it was this cold. As a mark of their worth, during the first 10 months of the war, the Corsairs flew 82% of the close-in tactical support missions. One squadron flew over 1,100 missions in a month. In English aircraft, this period also had a parallel development from their Hawker Typhoons and Tempests to their pinnacle, the Sea Furies. The climax of the line was the FB-11 Sea Fury, fitted with a Centaurus XV rotary engine outputting 2,550 horsepower. The Sea Fury was an outstanding aircraft, a tough customer in the attack role, but with light and responsive controls and excellent performance. While the F4U was built heavier to suit the thoughts of the time, the FB-11s were actually a lighter version of their Typhoon and Tempest forebears. These Hawker models used both inline and rotary engines and became very powerful, formidable aircraft. Today, few examples of these outstanding aircraft remain for the enthusiast to experience. Even fewer are in flying condition. Not surprisingly, both the Sea Fury and the Corsair have proven to be favourites with aircraft restorers. These Sea Furies were flown in Australia's island state of Tasmania in a recent air show and pylon race. The performance of these planes even today makes them an inspiring sight. Their classic shapes and throaty engines always draw large crowds in the hope of seeing a piece of classic aeronautic history. During the Korean War, there are a small number of reports of the two propeller planes attacking MiG-15 jets. One was of 8 MiGs trying to outturn 4 FB-11 Sea Furies. The result was a loss of 2 jets to the propeller-driven plane's cannons. 2 other MiGs were damaged, while the Sea Furies returned safely to their carrier. The era of a propeller fighter being launched from the rolling deck of an aircraft carrier continued up until the Vietnam War. They were superseded by the technological advances of the computer and the missile. The images seem to conjure romantic notions of sacrifice and honour, mixed strangely with the horror of war and the sadness of loss.